this course is called Nationality Building in Central Europe, or its old name, The People from Nowhere. And so it would seem appropriate that we begin by addressing the question of what is nationalism and what are national movements. Nationalism and national movements are social phenomena, and they have been the subject of numerous studies with a whole host of a wide range of interpretive explanations. Stated most simply, in the simple black and white, nationalism is an ideology that divides humanity into nationalities or peoples, and which argues that the optimal social system for this phenomenon, these nationalities, the optimal social system is when they enjoy complete cultural autonomy, a large degree of political autonomy, that means self-rule but not independence. And then some national ideologists will argue, and often argue, that the ideal goal is for a nationality to have its own independent state. And what is a nationality? Well, a nationality, often referred to in English, confusingly, as nation, nationality, sometimes nation, and sometimes it's confused that it's equal, but it's not. So I'm using the term nationality, not nation, as you'll see why. Nationality is a group of people united because they may have one or more of the following 6 characteristics. And again, I'm handing out these charts, which has it all. I actually have one of them myself, which will be helpful. And actually, when you get to the back, can you allow a couple of these to float in the last rows, and some of your colleagues can share them during this lecture? I'm very sorry that there are not enough of them today. So here, the 6 characteristics of what comprises a nationality. 1, territory, possibly but not necessarily statehood, but a territory. That's one characteristic. Language is another. Historical tradition. 4th, religion. 5, culture, or this kind of ethnographic features. And 6, sociocultural values, or the French like to say mentalité. Now, aside from these 6 common characteristics, which can be considered concrete, observable, objective features or factors, there are also 2 subjective factors, subjective. And these are very important elements in defining a nationality. And what are those subjective factors? As you can see on this chart, self-perception and will. Self-perception and will. Then we might ask, what is the interrelationship between these subjective factors and objective factors. Well, many groups of people, often called ethnic or ethnographic groups, they also have observable common characteristics, such as the ones I've just listed. But those group members of an ethnic group or an ethnographic group may not realize that they have things in common with each other, and therefore not realize that they belong to a larger national group or nationality. And so, it is the existence of a sufficiently large number of people who perceive themselves as being united that makes the difference between a nationality on the one hand, because they have that self-perception, and an ethnic or ethnographic group on the other. In other words, members of a particular group have to want to consciously belong to a given nationality. And so both of these subjective factors, self-perception and a will or desire, together with observable objective factors, these common characteristics, are together what determine the existence of a specific nationality. Now, with regard to these objective factors, those 6 common characteristics, territory, language, historical tradition, religion, culture, sociocultural values, we should note that, and this is important, that the presence or absence of any one characteristic does not in itself determine the existence of a nationality. So it's not one that makes it a nationality. On the other hand, it's not all 6. You have to have all 6 to be a nationality. Some national practitioners have argued that language is the so-called ultimate determining characteristic, and we'll talk about that at the end of this first lecture. That this is the ultimate, and in other words, each people must have its own distinct language in order to be considered a nationality. Of course, one only need to think of the Belgians or the Swiss, for that matter the Americans, among others. None of them have their own language. And therefore, to realize that this false nature of the language equals nationality question. All right, so now having defined, however briefly, a nationality, what about national movements? And the ideology behind those movements, nationalism. Nationalism. As a historic phenomenon, nationalism arose in Europe during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was in many ways a product of the French Revolution of 1789, in which the people, and not the state or its leading representatives, in this case the king, it was the people which were held to be the supreme source of political legitimization. And to drive that point home, they guillotined to cut off the king's head. So there was no more king. So in one sense, we can relate the beginning of nationalism to France and the French Revolution. Well, nationalism could also be seen to have evolved as a reaction, in particular to the reaction of French dominance throughout Europe at this time, whether in culture or in politics. This was particularly the case in the German lands or the Germanic lands at the outset of the 19th century. You know, at the outset of the 19th century, there was no Germany. There was just these tiny little duchies, kingdoms, states, etc. There was no one Germany. And so the French come in there, certainly under Napoleon, they dominate this whole particular area, and there's a reaction. Patriotic German writers and cultural activists are reacting to the presence of France's soldiers under Napoleon, and also reacting to the widespread of French language and cultural models by the German elite and the ruling strata in many countries. The elite spoke and used French, not the local languages. So many of patriotic German writers began to argue that the German language and German culture were at least the equal of French, and as such should be accorded respect, if nowhere else then in the Germanic lands itself. Now, of even more general influence were the writings of another German, a man named Johann Gottfried von Herder. Herder. This Herder was a quintessential child of the Enlightenment and its universal values. And why is he so important? Well, Herder argued that every culture throughout the world had its own particular worth and value. We're not talking about states here. We're talking about peoples and their cultures. Herder's influence was enormous throughout Central and Eastern Europe, the area that we're talking about or going to focus on. Why? Because he seemed to provide a universally applicable justification for pride in one's own culture, which in turn was of great importance for individuals who stemmed from peoples living in countries where their own language and their own cultures were either unrecognized or even scorned. Now, while nationalism spread throughout Eastern Europe after the French Revolution, its application and its goals varied from place to place, and that depended on specific political circumstances. In effect, one can speak of two types or two categories of nationalism, and they are also listed on that chart. And those two kind of types of national movements were state-imposed nationalism and intelligentsia-inspired nationalism. State-imposed nationalism and intelligentsia-inspired nationalism. Well, what does that mean? This first category, state-imposed nationalism, refers to already existing states whose governments hoped to gain the allegiance of their subjects by trying to convince them that they belonged to a nationality associated with a particular state. In the European context, Great Britain, France, Spain, the Russian Empire, or in the case of the subject of our course, Carpatho-Rusyns, Habsburg Austria or the Hungarian Kingdom. The point here is that all citizens of those countries, regardless of their ethnic origin and their nationality or their language, should define themselves according to the state in which they live. In other words, those inhabitants should be in effect or become British, French, Russian, Austrian, Hungarian. So that's state-imposed nationalism from above. The second category, intelligentsia-inspired nationalism. Intelligentsia-inspired nationalism. That refers to those peoples, groups, who lived in multicultural states where a language and culture other than their own was the dominant one, such as all of those states that I just mentioned, whether it's Britain or France or Austria or Spain or Russia, etc. In those circumstances, the group's self-appointed leaders, the intelligentsia really appointed themselves, no one elected them, but they came to represent a given people, and hence be called the national intelligentsia. Well, those members of the national intelligentsia worked to convince a given group of people that they formed a distinct nationality, and as such, they were deserving, at the very least, of cultural autonomy, if not political autonomy, and even better, independent statehood. Now, since Carpatho-Rusyns, which actually is the subject of this course, were a stateless people, as we're going to see, their nationalism was of the intelligentsia-inspired variety. Now, there are two other conceptual matters that are worth bearing in mind. The first of these has to do with what social scientists have recently been fond of referring to as primordialism and constructivism. Big words, but you're in political science, so that's all you do is read about these isms. So, primordialism and constructivism. Traditionally, national ideologists are almost all considered to be primordialists. Why? Because they argue that a national identity is in the blood, or more prosaically, is passed on from generation to generation through one's mother's milk. And these are terms that are used traditionally. In contrast to those primordialists, the constructivists argue that persons are not born with a national identity. Each person has to learn of his or her belonging to a particular nationality. Now, before the French Revolution and the beginning of the era of European nationalism that followed, most peoples in Europe may have spoken a distinct dialect. More often than not, they would identify themselves according to a specific religion or a geographic area, a city, a state, a region, or as the subject of a particular ruler. This is how they identified themselves. At various times in the long 19th century, and I'll be referring to this term quite often, and the long 19th century for this course effectively means from the 1780s until 1914. That is the long or historic 19th century. And at various times during that long 19th century, activists among the nationalist intelligentsia set out to convince the members of a particular group of their belonging to a larger nationality. In other words, They were constructing an ideology. In this case, a national identity, which they then set out to graft onto a group of people. And this is a process which some scholarly analysts have described as creating a kind of imagined community. An imagined community. This constructivist project, if you will, was carried out how? Well, by propagating their ideas, their nationalist ideas, via the print media, newspapers, journals, village reading circles, urban-based cultural organizations, things like libraries, theaters, museums, sports clubs. And in those cases where the ruling government was favorably inclined, which was usually very rare, but very important if you could pull it off, through the educational system. Because that's always the real name of the game. This diffusion of a national identity depended then on a network of communication facilities, and those in turn were a function of the degree of urbanization, industrialization, and the general modernization of a given society. And so in this scenario, access to and control of urban areas, control of the cities, became crucial for the success of stateless national movements. And this was particularly a challenge for many peoples in Central and Eastern Europe who lived primarily in the countryside and who comprised only a very small proportion of the inhabitants in towns and cities that were within or near their quote-unquote own national homeland. So, for instance, an example in the 19th century, the biggest challenge for the Czech national movement was to take control of Prague because it was controlled by German speakers, German culture, German theaters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if this diffusion of national identity was a challenge to peoples without a state, another challenge was the problem of disagreement among that nationalist intelligentsia itself as to just what the proper national identity should be. More often than not among these stateless peoples, their intelligentsia was divided between various factions that actually identified themselves with different nationalities. This was particularly the case in areas among stateless peoples, including our subject Carpathian Rus, where there were many nationalities living next to each other. In a sense, the national movement resembled a kind of ideological marketplace. An ideological marketplace where rival factions propagated their wares, their products, in this case, a national identity. And since no one was born with a fully formed national consciousness, then it was possible for an individual to be nationally constructed. Nationally constructed. In other words, swayed by one or more of those competing intellectual factions. Now, another factor or another conceptual matter to keep in mind is what might be called the phenomenon of multiple loyalties versus mutually exclusive identities. So multiple loyalties on the one hand, mutually exclusive identities on the other, as you can see underneath this chart of national movements. Now, in one sense, having multiple identities is actually the norm for most individuals in developed and developing societies. And that includes every one of you sitting here. You all have multiple identities, whether you realize it or not. In other words, each individual has these potential identities from which to choose. It could be a geographic residence. I come from Toronto, I'm a Torontonian. Or it could be some village or town outside of you, or a state. It also could be a religious orientation. I'm first and foremost belonging to some religion. Or it could be a language. Or it could be some ethnic group. By the way, certain individuals also put great emphasis and have strong loyalties and identity, first and foremost, with the university they attended. By the way, there was a time when someone from Harvard was indeed different from a graduate of Yale or Princeton, not to mention different from a graduate of a state university. Or they could identify with the social clubs that they belong, or the sports team that they support, or with sexual preference, especially if it is not heterosexual. So multiple identities is the norm. In the case of multinational states or 19th century empires like that of Austria-Hungary, as we're going to see, very important in this course, certain individuals could feel perfectly comfortable with more than one what might be called national identities. Sounds crazy? No, you can have more than one national identity. And so for residents of Carpathian Rus, as we're going to see, it was perfectly normal to be both a Carpatho-Rusyn and a Hungarian, or a Lemko and an Austrian. And then in the period after World War I, a Rusin and a Russian and a Czechoslovak, all at the same time. But as we're going to see, this Carpatho-Rusyn movement evolved. Some national activists became convinced that in order for the movement to survive, this otherwise natural hierarchy of multiple loyalties or identities had to be replaced by a perceptual framework of mutually exclusive identities. Mutually exclusive identities. That is, one should not be a Rusin and a Hungarian, or a Lemko and a Pole. One should be either one or the other. Finally, these intelligentsia-inspired national movements can be viewed as going through at least three basic stages. And as you can see on your chart, those three developmental stages are the heritage gathering stage, the organizational stage, and the political stage. And what is the characteristics of each of these? Well, very briefly, that first heritage gathering stage is a period in which individuals, in particular this self-described intelligentsia, collect the linguistic, the folkloric, the literary, the historical artifacts of a given people. The second stage is one in which, called organizations, but organizations like cultural organizations, schools, publications, formed to propagate knowledge about that cultural heritage that has been collected in the first stage. And the third stage witnesses efforts at participation in political life, often with the intention of obtaining territorial self-rule or autonomy and independence. And during the century and a half beginning in 1848, Carpatho-Rusyns, the subject of our course, experienced all three of these stages during periods that came to be known as national awakenings. And that's going to be part and an integral part of our story for the rest of this semester. Let me just say something really brief about language, because we are going to encounter language and the language question over and over and over again. Even though I said it's not the determining factor, but because so many people think it's the determining factor of what defines a nationality, let me just say just a few words about it. Language and the language question. What is our language? What do we speak? Hence, who are we? Now, language questions have certainly not been limited to Carpatho-Rusyns, the subject of this course. They've been an ongoing concern among many peoples in Europe, even those who had for centuries their own states and their own national language academies. So, for instance, even the allegedly most logically planned and carefully guarded national language, French, continues to this day to be debated by members of the Académie Française, the 40 immortals, who literally do nothing but discuss the French language and what is proper French. In particular, they have been concerned in the last 30, 40 years with the threat to their native linguistic patrimony by the all-pervasive force of modern English. How then does one create a language? Has anyone ever even thought about that? I mean, we all speak something, but it just doesn't happen like that. And what we speak and what we're taught to speak just doesn't happen. So how do you create what many of you try to speak when you speak English, including me? How does one create a literary language? The very notion of literary language should remind us of a basic reality. All literary languages are created. In other words, they do not exist naturally in the human environment. And the creators of literary languages, when they got around to doing it, these nationalist intelligentsias, have often had several options open to them of how to create a literary language. One option, to adopt an already existing literary language, either a sacred one associated with some centuries-old religious tradition like Hebrew or Greek or Latin or Church Slavonic. So you can choose one of these, which, by the way, Jews did from all over Europe who didn't speak Hebrew but went to Israel, and Israel decided that they're going to make their literary language some ancient language which the vast majority of the population didn't speak. Or you could choose a modern language in use already as an official medium. And that may or may not be related to the dialects spoken by the people for whom language is intended. By the way, Castilian Spanish for the Catalans as a linguistically related example, or English for the Irish as an unrelated example. Another option is to create a new literary language based directly on spoken dialects of the territory that you're arguing should have its language. But that also raises a question. which cluster of dialects are to be used as the possible basis upon which to build a literary language. So, for example, where does Luxembourgish end and German begin? From the perception of German ideologists and linguists, Luxembourgish is the German language. It's a German dialect. Well, it happens to be the official language of a state that belongs to the European Union, and it's one of the official 27 languages of the European Union. So a dialect of German in one people's eyes becomes a national official language in others. And then follows another question. From within a given cluster of dialects, which one of those dialects should be used for this proposed literary norm? Perhaps it should be only one dialect, and preferably the one spoken by the largest number of individuals, or the one which may also be representative of a political center. It's usually the dialect of a country's capital, or the culturally dominant group. Or perhaps the norm should be based on an amalgam of several or all of the dialects of a given cluster, so that the literary language would be more representative. And for nearly 4 centuries, as we are going to see, Carpatho-Rusyns have adopted variants of all of these above approaches to create a literary language. And let me then conclude at least this topic. You might ask, why having a literary language is so important? Like, what is the big deal? Well, this is because stateless peoples, including Carpatho-Rusyns, are spiritual children of that late 18th century German philosopher, Johann Gottfried von Herder, who posed his famous rhetorical question in a multi-volume work that he wrote, this is the Enlightenment period, called Letters for the Advancement of Humanity. Wonderful title. And here was his famous, often cited rhetorical question. Has a people, in particular a culturally underdeveloped people, anything dearer than the language of its ancestors? Therein resides its whole intellectual wealth, tradition, history, religion, and principle of life. Its very heart and soul. To deprive a people of its speech is to deprive it of its one eternal good. Now, despite our current understanding of nationalities as cultural constructs comprised of many elements, most Carpatho-Rusyn cultural activists in the past and present do maintain the position that language is the most important element that defines a people, or that in essence it is the very embodiment of a distinct people.